The plumber's voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who had found something he wasn't supposed to find. "Come home now," he said. "But come alone." I drove home not knowing that behind the locked door of my late wife's office, 41 years of marriage was about to become a question I didn't know how to answer. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. My name is Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. I say that not as an apology and not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact, the kind of fact that used to feel like an anchor and lately has begun to feel more like a coordinate. A fixed point from which to measure how far I have traveled, and how much of the terrain I thought I knew turned out to be something else entirely. I am a widower. That is the other fact that defines the shape of my days now, the way a missing wall defines the shape of a room. Wendy ZAHA, my wife, my partner, the woman who had occupied the center of my life for 41 years, died 14 months ago on a Wednesday morning in May, peacefully, the doctors said, which is the word they use when they mean without obvious suffering, and which I have come to understand is not the same thing as without mystery. She died of a cardiac event. Sudden, unexpected, no prior diagnosis that would have prepared either of us. She was 64 years old, and in what I believed was good health. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for the following Thursday. She had grocery lists on the refrigerator. She had a half-finished cup of coffee on her desk when the paramedics arrived. A half-finished cup of coffee. That detail has stayed with me more than almost anything else from that day. The coffee in the cup, still faintly warm when I touched it. The suggestion of an interrupted moment. Not a life concluded, but a life interrupted, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-whatever she had been in the middle of when her heart made its sudden and irrevocable decision. We had 41 years together. We met at a county fair in August of 1984. She was 23 and selling handmade jewelry at a booth her friend had set up, and I was 27 and had stopped to look at a pair of earrings I thought might suit my mother and ended up talking to the woman selling them for 2 hours instead. I drove her home that night and proposed to her 11 months later in the same spot at the same county fair, on the anniversary of the first time we'd spoken, because I have always believed that a man should be deliberate about the things that matter. We built a life together that I was proud of. A real life, not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a real one, with all the texture and weight and occasional roughness that real things have. I ran ZAHA Lumber and Hardware for 4 decades. Wendy ran the home, ran her own small interior design consulting business, ran everything with that particular competence she had, quiet, complete, never showy about it, just reliably, absolutely effective. She was the most capable person I have ever known. I believed I knew her completely. I want you to hold that sentence, because I believed it with absolute conviction for 41 years, and I am here to tell you that absolute conviction is sometimes the most elaborate form of blindness available to a human being. The house on Sycamore Lane is a 2-story craftsman with a wide front porch and a study on the second floor that Wendy had claimed as her office from the day we moved in. She had painted it herself, a deep, quiet blue she called morning water, and furnished it with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what a space needed to be. Bookshelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls. A wide oak desk by the window. A reading lamp with a warm amber bulb that made the whole room feel like late afternoon, even in the morning. After she died, I closed the door. Not locked it, just closed it. Left it exactly as it was. The half-finished coffee eventually dried and forgotten. The books in their places, the lamp unplugged but standing in its corner. It seemed wrong to disturb anything. It seemed, in the irrational way that grief has of rewriting the rules of the physical world, that disturbing the room would be disturbing her. So the door stayed closed, and the room stayed untouched, and I spent 14 months moving around that closed door the way you move around a bruise, carefully, with the kind of automatic avoidance that you eventually stop noticing, because it has become simply the shape of how you move through your own house. Last week, I noticed water staining on the ceiling of the first-floor hallway directly beneath Wendy's office. A leak. A slow one, the kind that has been happening quietly for some time before it announces itself through the ceiling below. I called the plumbing company I'd been using for years, Delwood Plumbing, reliable, local, a father and son operation out of Carver Falls. They sent their man, a fellow named Ray Cutter, who had been to the house twice before for minor repairs, and who I knew vaguely the way you know the reliable tradespeople in a small town, not as a friend, but as someone whose competence you have verified and whose word you trust. Ray arrived at 9 in the morning. I showed him the ceiling stain, told him the leak appeared to be coming from the bathroom adjacent to Wendy's office upstairs. I gave him access to both rooms, told him I'd be in the kitchen if he needed anything, and went downstairs to drink my coffee and read the paper. An ordinary morning. At 10:23, my phone rang. Ray's number on the screen. That struck me as slightly odd. Ray was upstairs. He could simply call down if he needed me. But tradespeople use their phones for everything now. I knew that, so I answered without particular concern. His voice was different from his ordinary working voice. Lower. More careful. The voice of a man choosing his words. "Mr. ZAHA," he said, "I found the leak. It's a split pipe behind the baseboard in the office. Not complicated to fix." A pause. "But sir, I think you need to come up here. There's something you need to see." I set down my coffee cup. "What kind of something, Ray?" Another pause. Longer. I'm not sure how to describe it, sir. I just think you need to see it yourself." And Mr. ZAHA, he stopped again, and in that stop was something that put the first cold finger on the back of my neck. "Come alone. I mean just you. No one else in the house right now, right?" "I'm alone," I said. "I'll be right up." I climbed the stairs slowly, not from age, but from the particular deliberateness of a man who is giving himself a few extra seconds before whatever is waiting at the top of them. I had not been in Wendy's office since the day of her funeral, when I had stood in the doorway for 30 seconds and then turned away because I couldn't manage it. The door was open now, Ray having opened it to access the work. The morning light fell across the floor the way it always had. The warm, particular light that came through the east-facing window in the first hours of the day and made the room feel like a painting of itself. Ray was crouching by the baseboard on the far wall, tools beside him, the baseboard panel removed to expose the piping behind it. He stood when I came in, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who had done something he was not comfortable having done and wanted to be clear that he hadn't meant to do it. "I'm sorry, Mr. ZAHA," he said. "I wasn't. This came loose when I moved the baseboard. It wasn't sealed back or anything. It just fell out." He pointed at the floor beside his toolbox. I looked down. On the floor of Wendy's office, beside Ray Cutter's toolbox, was a metal document box, the kind with a hinged lid and a small lock. Gunmetal gray, about the size of a shoebox. The lock was broken, the hasp hanging open, and the lid was slightly ajar, as if the box had shifted or fallen and the contents had moved inside. And sticking out from the slightly open lid, just barely visible, just enough, was the edge of what appeared to be a photograph. I stood very still for a moment. "It was sealed behind the baseboard panel," Ray said quietly. "Someone put it there deliberately. The panel had been recaulked around it. You can see the older caulk line. It wasn't something that fell back there by accident." He paused. "I wouldn't have opened it. I didn't open it. The hasp was already broken when it came out. The lid just shifted." I heard everything he said. I processed it with the surface part of my mind while the deeper part was doing something else entirely. Was looking at that metal box on my late wife's office floor and feeling the architecture of 41 years begin, very quietly, to creak. "Thank you, Ray," I said. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. "Go ahead and fix the pipe. Take whatever time you need." Ray nodded and crouched back to his work with the careful focus of a man who understood that the most respectful thing he could do right now was be very interested in plumbing. I crossed the room. I crouched down, and I opened the box. Mr. ZAHA just opened a box his wife hid behind a baseboard, sealed there deliberately, where no one was ever supposed to find it. Comment below right now. What do you think is in that box? What are you feeling in this moment? Drop your thoughts. I need to know. I have opened many things in my life. I have opened the doors of a business I built from nothing on a cold January morning in 1983 with $1,200 in a checking account and a handshake agreement with a lumber supplier who believed in me more than the numbers warranted. I have opened a hospital room door to see my wife holding our newborn daughter, her face so luminous with exhaustion and joy that I had to hold the doorframe to stay upright. I have opened an envelope containing a letter from my doctor telling me that the shadow on my chest X-ray was nothing to worry about, and I have opened an envelope containing a letter telling me that Wendy's estate was fully settled and that I was, legally and finally, and irrevocably, alone. I have opened things that changed my life, but I have never opened anything like that metal box. I lifted the lid with both hands, slowly, the way you lift something you suspect might be fragile or might be dangerous, and you're not yet sure which. The broken hasp swung loose. The lid came up. The first thing I saw was the photograph. It was a Polaroid, old, the colors slightly faded in that particular way of photographs from the early 1990s, the whites gone slightly yellow, the shadows deepened to brown. A woman and a child. The woman was young, mid-20s, I estimated, with dark hair and Wendy's particular way of holding her chin slightly up, the posture I had always associated with her confidence, her readiness for whatever the world offered. It was Wendy, a younger Wendy, early in our marriage, before the small changes that decades make in a face, but unmistakably her. The same strong jaw, the same wide-set eyes, the same expression of complete and unguarded happiness that she had reserved, in my experience of her, for moments of genuine and private joy. She was holding a child, a boy, toddler age, 2, maybe 3 years old, dark-haired like her, round-faced, laughing at something outside the frame of the photograph, one small hand gripping her collar. He was wearing a red shirt with a small dinosaur on the front. I did not recognize him. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in Wendy's handwriting, the precise, slightly slanted script I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and design notes for 30 years, 2 words and a date. My Thomas, 1991. The room was very quiet. Behind me, I could hear Ray working, the soft metallic sounds of tools on pipe, the occasional quiet shift of his weight on the floorboards. Outside the window, a car passed on Sycamore Lane. A dog barked once and stopped. I sat on the floor of my wife's office with a Polaroid photograph in my hands and felt the world do the thing it had done only a handful of times in my life. That deep, tectonic shifting, the sensation of the ground you thought was solid revealing itself to be something else, something that had been moving beneath you all along, slowly and without announcement, and has only now moved enough that you can feel it. We had been married since 1985. In 1991, we had been married for 6 years. I thought about 1991, thought about it the way you think about a year when someone has handed you a reason to examine it. The business had been in its 8th year, doing well, expanding. We had lived in this house for 3 years. We had been, as far as I had known, completely and happily and exclusively each other's. As far as I had known. I set the photograph carefully on the floor beside me and looked into the box. There was more. A second photograph, this one slightly newer, the colors less faded. The same boy, older now, perhaps 5 or 6, standing in front of what appeared to be an elementary school. He was wearing a backpack and looking seriously at the camera with an expression that was, with a jolt I felt physically in my sternum, familiar in a way I could not immediately locate. Something in the set of the eyes, something in the line of the jaw. I set that photograph down too. Beneath the photographs was a folded letter. The paper had the soft, slightly furry quality of something that had been folded and unfolded many times. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was not Wendy's. It was a man's handwriting, angular, forward-leaning, written with what appeared to be some urgency. Wendy, I understand your decision and I will respect it. I won't fight you on this, and I won't contact you again unless you reach out first. That's a promise, and you know I keep them. But I need you to know that he is healthy and good and growing upright. He has your eyes and your stubbornness, and he is going to be something. I make sure of it every day. If you ever change your mind about seeing him, about telling Marcus, about any of it, I will not stand in the way. That door is open as long as I'm standing. He knows your name. I made sure of that too. Whatever else, he knows his mother's name. D. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it precisely along its original creases and set it with the photographs. There were other things in the box. A hospital bracelet, the kind newborns wear, with the tiny printed name tag. I held it up and tilted it toward the window light to read the small print. Baby boy Harwell. May 14th, 1989. Harwell. Not ZAHA. For years into our marriage. For years. There was a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a birth certificate. An actual birth certificate, official, with a state seal. I opened it with hands that I was surprised to find were steady. Thomas Daniel Harwell. Born May 14th, 1989. Mother, Wendy and Harwell. Father, Daniel Joseph Harwell. Harwell. Her maiden name. She had listed herself under her maiden name. I sat with that for a moment. She had listed herself under her maiden name, which meant she had done this deliberately, had kept this separate from our marriage, had built a wall between this child and the life we had together, a wall so complete and so carefully maintained that in 41 years I had never once felt even the draft of what was on the other side of it. I looked at the birth date again. May 14th, 1989. I thought back through that year with the desperate, scrambling attention of a man trying to reconcile two versions of the same timeline. 1989, we had been married 4 years. The business was 6 years old, doing well. We were, I had believed, happy, settled, building toward a future that seemed clear and shared and entirely mutual. And in May of 1989, my wife had given birth to a child I had never known existed, a child she had apparently given up, or given to the father, a man named Daniel Harwell, whose name I did not recognize and whose handwriting I had never seen before this morning. A child she had hidden in a metal box behind a baseboard, sealed with caulk, locked away in the room she had kept as her private territory for 3 decades. There was one more thing in the box. A small envelope, sealed, with my name on the front. Marcus. Her handwriting. The M with the particular upstroke she always made. The way I had seen her write my name on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 40 years. I held the envelope and did not open it. Not yet. I was not ready yet. I became aware that the sounds from the wall had stopped. Ray had finished his work and was standing somewhere behind me, and I turned and found him by the door, his tools in his bag, giving me the maximum amount of space the room allowed, and looking at the middle distance with the studied neutrality of a decent man trying very hard to be invisible. "I'll let myself out, Mr. ZAHA," he said quietly. "I'll send the invoice by email. There's no rush." "Ray," I said. He paused. "I appreciate your discretion," I said. "I mean that genuinely." He nodded once, a single, serious nod. "I didn't see anything, sir. I found a pipe. I fixed it. That's all." He left. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the front door opening and closing with its familiar soft click. And I was alone in Wendy's office. I sat on the floor in the morning light with the metal box and its contents spread carefully around me. And I let the silence and the evidence speak to me without interruption, because I have always believed that the truth deserves to be heard completely before you start deciding what to do about it. She had been pregnant before I knew her. No, wait. 1989 was 4 years into our marriage. She had been pregnant during our marriage. She had carried a child, delivered him, named him, and given him to his father, all within the span of our marriage, and I had not known. I worked backward through the calendar of 1988 and 1989 with meticulous, painful attention. I thought about whether there had been any stretch of time when Wendy had been away from home for an extended period. A trip to visit her sister in North Carolina. Yes, there had been a trip, I remembered now, a long one, nearly 3 months, which she had explained as her sister needing help after a difficult surgery. I had visited once, for a long weekend. I had not been there for the other months. Her sister Sandra. I had accepted that explanation without a single question, because I had trusted my wife completely, and because a man who trusts completely does not audit the explanations of the person he trusts. 3 months. The last trimester. I pressed my palm flat on the floorboards and felt the solidity of the wood beneath me, the same wood that Wendy had walked on for 30 years, and I thought about who she had been, the woman I had loved, the woman who had made this house a home, the woman who had sat with me through every hard season of my life with a steadiness that I had always marveled at and now understood had been bought at a cost I was only beginning to calculate. She had carried a secret for 41 years. Not a small one. Not the kind of secret that is really just a privacy, a part of yourself held back from another person in the ordinary way of all human beings. A child. A living person, somewhere in the world, who was my wife's son and who had grown up knowing his mother's name, but nothing else, who carried her eyes and her stubbornness, according to the letter from a man named Daniel. A man named Daniel who had been, clearly, something to Wendy before, or during, our life together. A man who had kept his promise not to contact her. A man who had raised their son alone. I thought about Daniel's letter. He knows your name. I made sure of that too. I thought about a child growing up knowing only a name. I thought about the envelope on the floor beside me with Marcus written on it in her handwriting. I picked it up. I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, both sides, her handwriting filling every line with the density of someone who had been composing this for a long time and had a great deal to say. My darling Marcus, if you are reading this, then something has found its way to the surface that I spent a lifetime keeping beneath it. I don't know whether to feel relief or terror at that thought. Probably both. I need to tell you something I should have told you 35 years ago, and the fact that I am telling you this way, in a letter from wherever I am now instead of sitting across from you where I should have been, is the great cowardice of my life, and I know it. I have known it for a long time. Before I met you, I was with a man named Daniel Harwell. We were young and reckless, and certain we knew what love was, the way young people are certain about things they don't yet understand. When I found out I was pregnant, Daniel wanted to marry me. I said no, not because I didn't care for him, but because I already knew, Marcus, even then, that he was not who I was going to spend my life with. I didn't know your name yet. I didn't know your face, but I knew the shape of the life I wanted, and I knew Daniel wasn't the shape of it. But I was already pregnant. And when I found you, when I stood at that county fair booth and talked to you for 2 hours and drove home knowing that something had fundamentally changed, I was already 3 months along. I made a choice, Marcus. I have lived with it every day since. I told Daniel I would not marry him, but that I would carry the pregnancy. I went to Sandra's during the last months. I had the baby, a boy, healthy, beautiful, with dark hair and the look of someone who was going to ask hard questions about everything. I named him Thomas. I signed the papers that gave Daniel full custody. And I came home to you. I told myself it was the right thing. I told myself Thomas would have a better life with a father who wanted him fully than with a mother divided between 2 worlds. I told myself that you deserved a marriage that started clean. I told myself many things, Marcus, over many years, in this room, in this chair, at this desk, so many things that there were nights I almost believed them. What I could not tell myself, no matter how hard I tried, was that you didn't deserve to know. You deserve to know. You have always deserved to know. The fact that I was afraid of losing you, afraid of what you would think of me, afraid that the life we had built together was too good and too solid to survive the truth of what I had done. That fear was mine. You should not have been made to carry the consequences of my fear without even knowing you were carrying them. I am sorry, Marcus. I am sorry in a way that I do not have adequate language for, and I am sorry that this apology comes to you this way, through paper and a locked box and the gap behind a baseboard, instead of across a kitchen table where we could have faced it together. Thomas is a good person. I believe that with everything in me, even having watched him only from the terrible distance of a choice I couldn't take back. I kept the photographs because I couldn't not. I kept everything I could find because every record of him was a way of holding something I had given away. His last known address, as of 3 years ago when I last had contact with Daniel, is in the letter at the bottom of the box. I don't ask you to do anything with it. I don't ask anything of you at all, except this. Please don't let my cowardice be the thing that defines what we were. We were real, Marcus. Every single day of it was real. Whatever I hid from you, I never hid that. All my love, always and without reservation. You're Wendy. I read the letter once. Then I folded it along its creases and held it in both hands and sat in the morning light of my wife's office and let the grief come. Not the grief I had been living with for 14 months, the grief of losing her, but a new grief, a different one. The grief of understanding that the person you lost was both exactly who you believed they were and someone you had never fully known, and that both of those things could be completely true at the same time. I sat there for a long time, and then, slowly, I reached back into the box for the last piece of paper. Thomas Harwell's address. Wendy's letter just changed everything. Comment below right now. What are you feeling in this moment? Are you angry at Wendy? Do you understand her? And what do you think Mr. ZAHA should do about Thomas? Drop everything you're feeling in the comments right now. I am reading every single one. There is a question that sits at the center of every great betrayal, and it is not the question most people think it is. Most people think the question is how could they? How could she have kept this? How could she have looked me in the eye across 41 years of breakfasts and anniversaries and hard seasons and good ones? How could she have held my hand at the county fair booth where we met and known, even then, that she was carrying something she would never show me? How could she have built a life on a foundation with a hollow in it and never once, in all those years, pointed at the hollow and said, "Marcus, there is something here you need to know"? That is the question that announces itself first, loud and immediate, the way a car alarm announces itself, impossible to ignore, filling every available space. But it is not the real question. The real question, the one that arrived quieter, after the car alarm had exhausted itself, in the late afternoon stillness of Wendy's office, was something else entirely. Who was she? Not as an accusation, not as a rejection of the woman I had loved, but as a genuine, open, desperately sincere inquiry into the full dimensions of a person I had lived beside for 41 years and believed I understood completely, and had now discovered was larger than the understanding I had carried of her. Who was the woman who had made that choice at 23? Pregnant, unmarried to the father, already somehow certain that the life she wanted had a shape that Daniel Harwell did not fit, and had carried it with such complete composure that in 4 decades I had never once caught so much as a shadow of it. Who was the woman who had kept those photographs, who had written that letter, who had sealed a metal box behind a baseboard in her private room, and lived every day in full knowledge of what was behind that wall? Who was my wife? I sat in her office until the afternoon light changed, moving from morning gold to the flat pale light of midday, and I thought about every version of Wendy I had known. The young woman at the fair, confident and direct, who had talked to me for 2 hours about jewelry and design and what she wanted her life to look like. The new wife who had thrown herself into the house on Sycamore Lane with the energy of someone who needed a project large enough to fill a specific kind of space. The woman who had been, in our early years, occasionally and inexplicably sad, brief seasons of quiet that I had attributed to temperament, to the natural variance of a complex person, and had never pressed her on because she always came back from them and seemed herself again. I thought about those seasons of quiet differently now. I thought about 1989. I had gone back through that year in my memory so many times in the past few hours that it had taken on the texture of a place I had physically visited. We had been 4 years married. Happy, I had believed. And somewhere in that year, while I was running the business and building a future and believing in us completely, Wendy had been navigating the last months of a pregnancy, delivering a child, signing custody papers, and coming home to me with a grief she had decided, for reasons I was only beginning to understand, to carry alone forever. She had chosen to carry it alone forever. That was the thing I kept returning to. Not the initial decision. The initial decision had been made before I was even in the picture, in the complicated circumstances of a young woman who was already pregnant when she met the man she was going to love for the rest of her life. That I could, if I sat with it long enough, understand. People were complicated. People came to love with histories. People made decisions in youth that they carried forward into lives that looked nothing like the context in which those decisions were made. What I had more difficulty with was the ongoing decision. The choice, made again every single day for 41 years, to not tell me. The renewal of the secret every morning she woke up beside me and decided, again, that today was not the day. What had she been afraid of? I went back to her letter. I was afraid of losing you. Afraid of what you would think of me. Afraid that the life we had built together was too good and too solid to survive the truth. I held those words in my mind, and I tried to hear them the way she had felt them. Not as the abstract justifications of someone constructing a post hoc defense, but as the genuine, daily terror of a woman who had loved something so much she had been willing to disfigure herself to protect it. She had been afraid that I would leave. She had been so certain that I would leave, so certain that my love for her was conditional on a version of her that was clean and uncomplicated and without history, that she had maintained a secret of this magnitude for 4 decades rather than risk finding out. And sitting in her chair, at her desk, in the quiet of her morning water blue room, I found myself confronting a question I had no clean answer to. Was she wrong? If she had told me in 1989, if she had sat me down and said, "Marcus, there is something I need to tell you. I had a baby before we married. A boy. I gave him to his father. He is 3 months old and living somewhere in this state with a man I was never going to spend my life with." What would I have done? I tried to answer honestly. I was 29 in 1989. I was a man of my times, which is a polite way of saying I had certain ideas about things that I am not entirely proud of in retrospect. A man who believed that the woman he married was his, completely, without prior entanglement of that particular kind. A man who might have, who, if I am being completely honest with myself in the way that this moment demanded, might have responded very badly. Might have left. Wendy had known me. She had loved me. Yes, but she had also seen me clearly, perhaps more clearly than I had seen myself. And she had calculated the risk and decided it was unsurvivable. And she had been protecting something. Not just herself, or not primarily herself. She had been protecting us. Protecting the life she believed in, the marriage she wanted, the version of our future where Marcus ZAHA stayed. She had paid an enormous price for that protection. And so, it occurred to me, had Thomas Daniel Harwell, born May 14, 1989, now 35 years old, living, according to the address at the bottom of Wendy's box, at 4412 Birchwood Drive, Crestview Falls, a town 40 miles from where I was sitting. 40 miles. For 35 years, my wife's son had lived 40 miles away, and I had not known he existed, and he had grown up knowing only his mother's name. I stood up from Wendy's chair, carefully, and went to the window. Sycamore Lane was quiet in the afternoon light. Mrs. Patterson from 3 doors down was walking her retriever. The Callaway boy was shooting hoops in his driveway with the rhythmic, meditative persistence of a teenager who had nowhere better to be. 2 kids on bikes. An ordinary street on an ordinary afternoon. The world completely unaware that in the second-floor office of the Craftsman House, with the wide front porch, a 68-year-old man was trying to figure out who he was in relation to a truth he had been living beside without knowing it. I picked up my phone. I stood at the window, and I did something I had not planned to do, had not decided to do, had not thought through in the careful, methodical way I usually approach significant actions. I searched for Thomas Daniel Harwell in Crestview Falls. He was not difficult to find. He was a contractor, a builder, specifically residential construction. Harwell Building and Renovation. A website, modest and professional, with a photograph of a man standing in front of a half-framed house with the comfortable stance of someone who knew what they were doing and didn't need to perform it. I enlarged the photograph and felt the floor shift beneath me one more time. Because the man in the photograph, 35 years old, dark-haired, looking at the camera with that direct, slightly serious expression, had Wendy's chin, Wendy's wide-set eyes, Wendy's particular posture, the chin slightly up, the readiness for whatever the world offered. And something else. Something that took me a moment to locate, and then hit me with a force I was not prepared for. He had my hands. Not Wendy's hands. Wendy had fine-boned, precise hands. The hands of a woman who worked with fabrics and color swatches and small, careful decisions. This man's hands, visible at the edges of the photograph, gripping a framing level. They were broad and square-fingered and strong-knuckled. They were my hands. I sat down very suddenly on the edge of Wendy's desk. I looked at the birth certificate again. Mother, Wendy and Harwell. Father, Daniel Joseph Harwell. Daniel. I thought about Wendy's letter. Before I met you, I was with a man named Daniel Harwell. Before I met you. But we had met in August of 1984, and Thomas had been born in May of 1989, which was almost 5 years later. And the letter from D had said, he has your eyes and your stubbornness. But those hands in the photograph were not the hands of a man whose father was Daniel Harwell. Unless Wendy's timeline in the letter was not entirely precise. Unless before I met you was the story she had needed to tell herself. The story that made the geography of events fit into a shape she could live with. Unless Daniel Harwell, good man who kept his promises, had agreed to be listed as the father on a birth certificate for a child who was not his, because Wendy had asked him to, and because he loved her enough to do it. Unless Thomas Daniel Harwell, 35 years old, contractor in Crestview Falls, was not Daniel's son at all. I set the birth certificate down. I sat in the silence of my wife's office, and I felt the full, extraordinary weight of what I was holding. The weight of a secret that was not shaped the way I had initially believed it was shaped, that was larger and more complex and more consequential than even Wendy's letter had fully revealed, and that had been sitting behind a baseboard in this room for God only knew how many years, waiting for a split pipe and a decent plumber named Ray Cutter to bring it into the light. I did not call Gerald Beaumont. This was not a legal matter. I did not call my daughter in Atlanta, my other child, my known child, who was 30 years old and would need to be part of this eventually, but not today, not until I understood more. I did not call anyone. What I did was go downstairs, into the kitchen, and make a pot of coffee. Real coffee, not the quick single-cup kind, but the full-pot kind, the kind you make when you have something to sit with for a while. I poured a cup, and I went to the front porch, and I sat in the wooden chair that had been on that porch since Wendy and I moved in, and I let the late afternoon settle around me. I thought about 41 years of marriage. I did not think about them with anger. I want to be clear about that, because anger would have been easier. Anger had a direction to it, a momentum. What I felt was more complicated than anger and more demanding. What I felt was the particular, vertiginous grief of understanding that the person you loved most in the world had been, simultaneously, exactly who you knew and someone you had never fully met. She had loved me. Her letter had said so, and I believed it, not because I needed to believe it, but because I knew her well enough, even now, even knowing what I now knew, to recognize the truth in it. Whatever I hid from you, I never hid that. She had hidden many things, but not that. The love had been real. I was certain of it with the same certainty that I was certain of my own name. But love and honesty were not the same thing, and I had spent 41 years treating them as interchangeable. The afternoon deepened toward evening. The street went quiet. I sat on the porch until the first stars appeared in the sky above Sycamore Lane, and by the time I went back inside, I had made two decisions. The first was that I was going to find out the truth about Thomas. Not the legal truth, not the documented truth of a birth certificate filled out with careful deliberation. The real truth, the biological truth, the answer to the question that had been forming in the back of my mind since I had looked at those hands in a photograph and felt something recognize something. The second was that if the truth was what I suspected it was, I was not going to look away from it. I had spent 41 years with a woman who had looked away from a hard truth because she was afraid of what acknowledging it would cost her. I was not willing to be that. I owed it to Wendy, to the full, complicated, imperfect, remarkable woman she had actually been, to be braver than her fear had allowed her to be. And I owed it to a 35-year-old man in Crestview Falls who had grown up knowing only his mother's name. I called my daughter Rebecca the next morning. She is 30 years old, lives in Atlanta, works in hospital administration, and has her mother's practicality and my stubbornness in roughly equal measure. She is the child I raised, the child I know, the child whose entire life I have been present for. Telling her what I had found was one of the hardest conversations I have ever had. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I'm still finding out what okay means in relation to this. Do you think Thomas is actually—" "I don't know," I said. "That's one of the things I need to find out." Another silence. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go see him," I said. "Dad, Rebecca, he doesn't know you exist," she said. "You understand that, right? He's 35 years old, and he grew up without a mother, and now a 68-year-old stranger is going to show up at his door and tell him." "What exactly? What are you going to tell him?" It was a fair question. It was the question I had been sitting with since the previous afternoon on the porch. "I'm going to tell him the truth," I said. "As much of it as I know. And I'm going to let him decide what to do with it." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Mom kept so much from us," she said softly, and in her voice was something young and hurt. The particular wound of a child discovering that a parent was human in ways you weren't prepared for. "She did," I said. "And I think she paid for it every day. And I think the best thing we can do for her memory is to not let what she was afraid to do stay undone." A long pause. "I want to come," Rebecca said. "When you go to see him. I want to be there." "Not the first time," I said gently. "The first time needs to be just me. But after that, yes. After that, I think we all need to be in the same room." She agreed, reluctantly, with the worried energy of a daughter who had just discovered that her parents were larger and more complicated than the versions she had grown up with, and who was handling it with more grace than I had any right to expect. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with Wendy's letter in front of me, and I read it one more time. The whole thing, every word, including the parts that hurt, and especially the parts that asked something of me. "Please don't let my cowardice be the thing that defines what we were." "I won't, Wendy," I said, to the empty kitchen, to the rooster clock on the wall, to the half-world between the living and the gone where I had gotten in the habit of addressing her. "But I need you to understand something. I am going to finish what you couldn't. Not to punish you, because it's right." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, A cardinal landed on the feeder Wendy had put up the year before she died. I took it as an answer. Mr. ZAHA just made a decision that could change everything. For him, for Rebecca, and for a 35-year-old man 40 miles away who has spent his whole life knowing only his mother's name. Comment below right now. Do you think Mr. ZAHA should go? What would you do in his place? And did you catch the moment with those hands in the photograph? Drop everything you're feeling in the comments. I am reading every single word. I did not go immediately. I want to be honest about that, because the story of a man who receives news of this magnitude on a Tuesday and drives 40 miles on a Wednesday to knock on a stranger's door would be the story of a reckless man, and whatever else I am not reckless. I am deliberate. I have always been deliberate. It is the quality that saved my business in 3 separate downturns, and the quality that kept my marriage intact through seasons that would have broken something less carefully tended. And it was the quality I needed most now, when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. I spent 4 days preparing. Not preparing in the way of strategies and legal frameworks. This was not that kind of situation. I prepared the way you prepare for something that has no template, no precedent in your own life, no instruction manual written by someone who has been here before you. I prepared by sitting with it, by reading Wendy's letter so many times that I had memorized it without intending to, by going through the box again, slowly, examining each photograph with the attention of a man trying to read a language he has never studied but somehow, distantly, recognizes, by asking myself, over and over, what I was actually going to say. On the second day, I drove to a clinic in Millbrook and asked about DNA testing, the kind that could be done discreetly, that could provide the answer to the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since I had looked at those hands in a photograph. The doctor I spoke with was matter-of-fact and kind and explained the process clearly. A cheek swab from me and a cheek swab from Thomas, sent to a lab, results in 5 to 7 business days. Simple, in theory. Except that getting Thomas's cheek swab required first getting Thomas. Required finding a way to approach a 35-year-old man who had grown up without his mother and presenting him with the information that his mother's husband, a man he had never heard of, believed he might be his biological father. There was no clean way to do that. There was only the true way. On the third day, I called the number listed on the Harwell Building and Renovation website. It rang 3 times and went to voicemail. A recorded message, professional and brief, a man's voice that was low and even and somehow, in its unhurried quality, familiar in the way that certain things are familiar before you can explain why. I did not leave a message. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the beep, and then I ended the call and set the phone down and went back to the kitchen table and thought about what I was doing and why and whether it was right. It was right. I came back to that every time, from every angle I approached it. Whatever the complications, whatever the pain it might cause or the disruption it would create in a life that had presumably been built on the understanding of one set of facts, it was right. Thomas Harwell deserved to know the truth about his origins. He deserved it not because I needed him to know, not to satisfy my own need for clarity, but because every person on this earth deserves to know where they came from. Wendy had believed she was protecting everyone by keeping this sealed behind a baseboard. What she had actually done was defer the cost to a future she wouldn't be present for. I was the future. On the 4th day, a Saturday, I put on clean clothes, not the serious gray suit that felt wrong for this occasion, but good clothes, the kind that say I am someone who takes this seriously without saying I have come here to perform authority. Dark trousers, a button-down shirt, a jacket that Wendy had picked out for me 3 years ago at a department store on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of ordinary errand that I now understood had been threaded through with a subterranean life I hadn't been able to see. I put her letter in my jacket's inside pocket. I got in the car. Crestview Falls was 41 miles from Sycamore Lane by the route I took. 41 miles of Tennessee Valley Highway. The morning mist still sitting in the low places between the hills. The sky the particular clear pale blue of a November morning that has decided to be kind. I drove at a steady pace, not hurrying, not delaying, just moving through the distance between where I had been and where I was going with the focus of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it. 4412, Birchwood Drive was a house in a neighborhood of modest, well-kept homes, the kind of neighborhood where people took care of their property not because they were wealthy, but because they were proud. The house was a ranch-style, brick front, with a concrete driveway on which sat a work truck. A serious one, with a rack on the back and the logo of Harwell Building and Renovation on the door. The lawn was clean. There were 2 large oak trees in the front yard, already bare for November, their empty branches making a clean geometric pattern against the pale sky. I sat in my car in front of the house for 4 minutes. I am not ashamed of those 4 minutes. I used them well. I thought about Wendy, about Rebecca, about a Polaroid photograph of a woman holding a laughing baby in a red dinosaur shirt, about 41 years of a marriage that was real and true, and also incomplete in a way that I was only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of. I thought about what I would want if I were the man in that house. If I were 35 years old and someone knocked on my door with a truth my mother had sealed behind a wall, I would want to know. I got out of the car. I walked up the driveway. The morning was cold and still. I could hear, from somewhere behind the house, the sound of something being worked on, a rhythmic, focused sound, the sound of a man doing physical work with attention and competence. I went around the side of the house. He was in the backyard. He was working on what appeared to be a section of privacy fence, replacing boards, from the look of it, with the economical movements of someone who had done this kind of work 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about the mechanics of it. He was wearing work clothes, a canvas jacket, and he had his back to me as I came around the corner. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, going slightly gray at the temples. He turned when he heard my footsteps on the frozen ground, and I saw his face. I had thought I was prepared. I was not prepared, because the man who turned to look at me in that backyard in Crestview Falls on a November morning was, in the most specific and undeniable way, a younger version of a face I had seen in the mirror for 68 years. The jaw, the brow, the particular set of the eyes. The way his chin came slightly up when he encountered something unexpected. That was Wendy's, that part was hers. But everything else, the architecture of the face, the structure beneath the skin, was something I recognized from my own reflection. He looked at me with the careful, neutral expression of a man encountering an unexpected stranger on his property and not yet having decided what to make of it. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was low and even, the voice from the voicemail. Unhurried. I stood at the edge of his yard and I looked at my wife's son and I felt, in that moment, something I had not expected to feel. Not shock. I had been bracing for the visual confirmation since the photograph on the website. Not anger. I had worked through the anger in 4 days of careful, deliberate sitting with it. What I felt was grief. The clean, pure, uncomplicated grief of a man who has just understood something that cannot be undone. The grief of 35 years that this man had lived without knowing what I was looking at right now, without knowing the full truth of where he came from, without having someone see his face and recognize it from the inside. "My name is Marcus ZAHA," I said. "I was married to Wendy Harwell for 41 years. She passed away 14 months ago." The fence board in his hand lowered slowly. His expression changed, not dramatically, not with the Hollywood collapse of a man receiving a thunderbolt, but with that subtle, internal rearrangement I had come to recognize as the way real things actually registered on a real person. Something moved behind his eyes. Something was recalculated. "Wendy," he said. Just the name. Flat, careful, feeling its weight. "Yes," I said. He set the fence board down against the frame. He looked at me steadily for a moment. "How did you find me?" "She left a box," I said, "sealed in her office. I found it 4 days ago. There was an address." A silence, long enough that I could hear the November wind moving through the bare oak trees at the front of the house. "She never contacted me," he said. I wondered whether she would." A pause. "Whether she'd told you." "She hadn't," I said. "Not while she was alive." He absorbed that. I watched him absorb it with the same deliberate steadiness I had been trying to maintain in myself for 4 days, and I recognized it as the quality of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to hold difficult things without being capsized by them. "What do you want, Mr. ZAHA?" he said. It was a fair question, a direct one. I respected it. "I want to tell you the truth," I said. "All of it. And then I want you to decide what you do with it." He studied me for a moment. Then he set down his tools. "Come inside," he said. His kitchen was clean and functional. A working man's kitchen, nothing decorative, everything in its place for reasons of utility rather than aesthetics. He made coffee without asking whether I wanted any, which I appreciated, and set a mug in front of me at the kitchen table, and sat across from me with his own, and looked at me with those eyes that were Wendy's eyes and waited. I told him everything. I started at the beginning. The county fair in August of 1984, the 2-hour conversation, the marriage 11 months later. I told him about the business, about the life we had built, about who Wendy had been as a person, not as a confession or an apology, but as context, because he deserved context. He deserved to know who his mother had been beyond the name he had grown up with. I told him about the box, about Ray and the split pipe and the sealed baseboard, about the photographs, the birth certificate, the letter from Daniel, whose name Thomas confirmed with a small nod when I mentioned it. Daniel Harwell, who had died 6 years ago of a stroke. Thomas told me quietly, a good man, a decent father, a man who had kept every promise he made. I told him about Wendy's letter. I took it from my inside pocket and set it on the table between us and told him he could read it if he wanted to, that it was addressed to me, but that it spoke to him and about him and that it belonged, in every meaningful sense, as much to him as to me. He looked at the letter on the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. There's something else, he said. Not a question. He had been watching my face, the same way I had been watching his, and he had seen something there that told him we hadn't arrived at the full truth yet. Yes, I said. I told him about the hands in the photograph, about the timeline that didn't fully reconcile, about the things I had noticed in his face that morning that I had already been suspecting for 4 days and was now, sitting across from him in his kitchen, completely certain of. He was very still while I said it. When I finished, the kitchen was absolutely quiet. Daniel never said, Thomas said. His voice was careful, controlled, but I could hear something underneath it, something that had been waiting a long time for a specific kind of information. He raised me as his own. He always said I was his. Daniel may not have known, I said. Or he may have known and chose to be your father anyway. Either way, he was your father in every sense that matters day to day. I am not here to diminish that. Thomas looked at the table, at the letter, at his coffee cup, then out the window at the backyard where his fence stood half repaired in the November morning. So you're saying you might be my... I don't know, I said. Not with certainty. That's why I'm here. Because you deserve to know the possibility exists, and because if you want to know the answer, I want to find it with you. A long silence. Why, he said. He looked back at me. You didn't have to come here. You could have read that letter and sealed the box back up and never told anyone. Why did you come? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Wendy's letter and what it had asked of me. I thought about Rebecca, 30 years old in Atlanta, who had grown up as an only child and who did not yet know that she might not be. I thought about Daniel Harwell, who had kept every promise he made and raised a boy alone with love and steadiness, and who deserved to have that legacy honored rather than hidden. Because your mother spent 41 years being afraid, I said, and I think she spent every one of those years paying for it. And I think the least I can do, the very least, is be less afraid than she was. Thomas Harwell looked at me across his kitchen table for a long moment. And then something happened in his face. Something shifted, quietly and completely, like a door that has been closed for a long time opening on well-oiled hinges. Not a dramatic shift. Not tears, not collapse. Just an opening. A man who had been holding something without knowing exactly what he was holding, finally being offered a place to set it down. I have a box too, he said. I looked at him. Daniel left me things when he died. About my mother. Photographs, some letters. Things she sent him over the years. She did contact him, it turns out. Not often, but she did. He paused. I always wanted to know more. I never knew how to find more. You have letters? I said. A whole box, he said. I'll get it. He stood up from the table, and I sat in his kitchen in Crestview Falls and thought about Wendy. Thought about her with a fullness I hadn't had access to 4 days ago. A fullness that included all of her now. The parts one had known and the parts one hadn't. The woman who had loved me and the woman who had been afraid and the woman who had, apparently, spent years sending quiet letters to the father of her firstborn child, maintaining from a careful distance a thread of connection she hadn't been willing to entirely sever. She had not been able to let go. Not of Thomas. Not completely. She had sealed a box behind a baseboard, yes, but she had kept the photographs, written the letter, held his address in the last piece of paper at the bottom of everything. She had been a woman in conflict with herself for 41 years, and the conflict had never resolved, and she had died with it unresolved, and she had left it to me. She had left it to me because she trusted me. Even in her cowardice, she had trusted me. Thomas came back with a shoebox, plain cardboard, and set it on the table between us. He sat back down. He pushed it toward me slightly, not all the way, just enough to make it shared territory. I think, he said slowly, that we both have pieces of the same thing. Yes, I said. I think so too. I reached into the shoebox and took out the first letter. Wendy's handwriting. Dated June 1992. Dear Daniel, Thomas must be walking now. Is he walking? I think about that. I think about whether he walks the way Marcus walks, that particular way Marcus has of. I stopped reading. I set the letter down. I looked at Thomas. He was looking back at me with Wendy's eyes in my hands and the expression of a man who has just arrived somewhere he has been trying to find for a very long time. She wrote about you, he said quietly. In almost every letter. She wrote about you. I did not trust my voice for a moment. When I found it, I said, she loved you. Whatever choices she made, she loved you. I want you to know that with certainty. Thomas nodded slowly. I believe that, he said. I think I've always believed that. I needed someone who knew her to confirm it. We sat with that for a while. The coffee went cold between us. Neither of us moved to refresh it. 2 men, 2 boxes. 35 years of a secret finally meeting itself in a kitchen in Crestview Falls. Comment below right now, what are you feeling in this moment? Did that final revelation hit you the way I think it did? What do you think happens next between Mr. ZAHA and Thomas? Drop everything in the comments. Every single thought. I want to hear it all. No. There is a moment in every long journey when the road stops demanding things of you. Not the end of the journey. Not yet. Just a pause. A clearing. A place where the terrain flattens briefly and you can stand still and look at where you have come from and where you are going and take a full breath for the first time in what feels like a very long while. I found that moment in Thomas Harwell's kitchen in Crestview Falls on a November morning, with cold coffee between us and a shoebox full of Wendy's handwriting on the table and a man across from me who had my hands and his mother's eyes and 35 years of questions he had been carrying with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned, out of necessity, not to expect answers. We sat in that kitchen for 3 hours. I want you to understand what 3 hours means in the context of what we were doing. We were not filling 3 hours with the comfortable noise of people who know each other well. We were building something from the ground up, in real time, with the careful attention of 2 people who understood that what they were constructing mattered and that rushing it would damage it. We read Wendy's letters. Not all of them. There were 23 in the shoebox, spanning from 1992 to 2019, and some of them were long, and some of them were brief, and all of them were written by a woman who was trying to maintain a connection to something she had given away while simultaneously honoring the life she had chosen to live in the other direction. She had written about Thomas with the particular love of a person who cannot be present for a life but refuses to be entirely absent from it. She had written about whether he was walking, whether he had started school, whether he liked it, whether he was making friends. She had written about his interests. Daniel had apparently written back, because Wendy's letters referenced things Daniel had told her, small updates about a boy growing up in Crestview Falls. She had known, at a distance, that Thomas liked baseball and was good at math and had Daniel's steadiness, and something else. She wrote, something she couldn't name exactly, a quality of attention, the way he apparently focused on a problem with complete absorption until it resolved. That is not Daniel, she had written in a letter from 1999, when Thomas was 10. I see it in him from Daniel's descriptions, and I know where it comes from, and I am glad he has it even though I cannot tell him so. I read that line twice. Thomas, sitting across from me, watched me read it and said nothing. When I set the letter down, he said, "She knew." She knew, I confirmed. He nodded slowly. Not with bitterness. I watched carefully for bitterness and did not find it, which told me something important about who Thomas Harwell was and how he had been raised. What I found instead was something more complex and more dignified than bitterness. Something that looked like a man finally receiving information he had always suspected and finding that having it, even at this late date, even at this cost, was better than not having it. Daniel never told me, Thomas said, about any of it. The letters, the uncertainty about who my father was. He just raised me. He never made me feel like a question he was carrying. He was a good man, I said. The best I knew. Thomas said simply. We were quiet for a moment. both of us honoring Daniel Harwell without needing to say that we were doing so. I have a daughter, I said then. Rebecca. She's 30. She lives in Atlanta. I paused. She knows about you. I told her 4 days ago. She wants to meet you. Not today, not until you're ready, but she wants to. Thomas absorbed this. A sister, he said, carefully, like a word in a language he had studied but never spoken aloud. Possibly, I said, if the test confirms what I believe. But even if the biology is what I think it is, you should know that Rebecca is not the kind of person who needs a test result to decide how she feels about something. She's her mother's daughter in that way. She decides, and then she commits. Something moved across Thomas's face, quick and unguarded, and then contained again. But I had seen it. The flash of something that was not quite hope. Hope was too simple a word for it, but was related to hope the way a foundation is related to a house. The structural thing underneath. What about you, he said. What do you need? From this, from whatever this is. It was the right question. Direct and honest, and asked without the performance of not needing anything, which would have been a lie, and Thomas, I was coming to understand, did not deal in lies. I need to know the truth, I said. The biological truth. Not because it changes anything fundamental about who you are or who I am, but because I am 68 years old and I have just discovered that my wife had a secret she carried for 41 years, and I believe the only honorable response to that is to finish the accounting. To know the full truth, even the parts that are difficult. Thomas nodded. And after the truth, he said. I thought about how to answer that. After the truth, I said, I would like to know you, if you're willing. Not as a project, not as an obligation, not as the resolution of a dead woman's guilt. As a person, as someone who is, who may be, connected to me in the most fundamental way a person can be connected to another, and who has been, in any case, connected to someone I loved for 41 years. A silence. She was worth loving, he said. My mother. I looked at him across the table. This man with my hands and Wendy's eyes. This man who had grown up on the far side of a choice made in fear, who had been raised by a good and steady man who kept his promises, who had built something of his own, a business, a home, a life of evident competence and quiet dignity, without the benefit of a mother's presence or a complete account of his own origins. She was the most remarkable person I have ever known, I said. She was imperfect in ways I am only now beginning to understand the full scope of. She was afraid in ways that cost both of us more than they should have. And she loved you. She loved you from 40 miles away for 35 years in the limited and inadequate way that was all she allowed herself. And I believe it was a grief she carried every day. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. That's enough, he said finally. That's enough. The DNA test results came back on a Thursday morning, 9 days after I had sat in Thomas Harwell's kitchen in Crestview Falls. I had requested the results by email, and I sat at the kitchen table on Sycamore Lane with my coffee and my phone and opened the email with the particular steadiness of a man who has already made peace with whatever the answer is going to be, because he has understood that the answer does not change what needs to be done, only clarifies the precise nature of it. The results were not ambiguous. Thomas Daniel Harwell was my biological son. I sat with that for a while, not in shock. I had known, in the way you know things before the evidence confirms them, since the morning I had looked at a photograph on a contractor's website and felt something recognize something. But knowing and having confirmed are different countries, and the border between them, when you cross it, costs something. I thought about Wendy. I thought about what she had known, and she had known. Her letter made that clear. I see it in him and I know where it comes from, and the weight she had carried with that knowledge. The weight of knowing that the man she loved had a son in the world who did not know his father, that the son she had given away was more deeply connected to her husband than even the giving away had fully severed, that the secret was not just a secret about the past, but a living, ongoing reality 40 miles away that grew and changed and built things and had no idea what it was built from. She had carried that for 35 years, and she had not been able to tell me. I picked up my phone and called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. The results came, I said. A brief silence. I got them too, he said. Then you know. Yes, he said. I know. We were quiet for a moment, both of us on our separate ends of a phone line that connected two people who had just had the largest fact of their relationship confirmed by a laboratory in a way that left no room for interpretation. How are you? I said. He thought about it. I don't know yet, he said. Ask me again in a week. Fair enough, I said. Thomas, I need you to know something. Whatever you decide to do with this, whatever pace you need, whatever distance or closeness you need, I will follow your lead. You have been the one without information in this situation your whole life. I am not going to become another person who makes decisions about your life without consulting you. A pause. Thank you, he said. And then, after a moment, can I ask you something? Anything, I said. The house where she lived. Where you live. Is there anything of her still there? Anything I could see someday? I thought about the morning water blue office. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The wide oak desk by the window. The reading lamp with the warm amber bulb. The box that Ray Cutter's plumbing work had set free. Everything, I said. I haven't changed a thing. Thomas came to Sycamore Lane on the first Saturday of December. He came alone, which I had expected, because Thomas Harwell was the kind of man who processed significant things in his own company before he was ready to process them with others, and I recognized this quality because I shared it. I opened the front door before he reached the porch, and we stood for a moment in the December morning looking at each other. This man who was my son, and who I had not known existed 8 weeks ago, standing on the porch of the house his mother had lived in for 30 years, in the cold, bright air of a Saturday that had decided to be clear and sharp and without ambiguity. Come in, I said. It's cold. I had made coffee. I had made eggs and toast, the full breakfast, Dorothy's, Wendy's recipe, the one with the cream and the eggs. I had set the table properly, with the good dishes, because this was a proper occasion, and I was a man who believed that proper occasions deserved acknowledgement. Thomas ate with the appetite of a man who does physical work and doesn't pretend otherwise, and I ate across from him, and we talked. Not about the large things, not yet, but about the ordinary things, because the ordinary things were where you learned who a person actually was. He told me about a project he was working on, a full renovation of a 1940s colonial in Crestview Falls, the kind of structural work that required understanding how old buildings were put together before you could responsibly take them apart. I told him about ZAHA lumber, about 41 years of running it, about what I had learned about wood and structure and the particular patience required to build something meant to last. We were talking the same language. We both noticed it. I saw it register in his face, the slight quickening of attention when he realized that the man across from him knew what he was talking about, that the conversation didn't require translation. After breakfast, I took him upstairs. I stood outside the door of Wendy's office for a moment. The same door I had stood outside for 14 months. The door I had not been able to open until a split pipe and a decent plumber had made the decision for me. I opened it. Thomas stood in the doorway of his mother's office and looked. The morning light was coming through the east window the way it always did, laying itself across the floor in long, warm rectangles. The books were on their shelves, the desk was by the window, the amber reading lamp stood in its corner, unplugged but present. The morning water blue walls held the quiet of a room that had been a thinking place for decades. He stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. I stood behind him and let him have the room. Finally he walked in, slowly, with the careful attention of someone who understood they were in a space that mattered, that held something they needed to be respectful of. He ran his hand along the spines of the books on the nearest shelf. He looked at the photographs on the wall, Wendy's design photographs, clippings and inspiration images she had collected over the years, arranged with her characteristic precision. He stood at the window and looked out at the Sycamore Lane street below. He turned around. This was her, he said. Not a question, a recognition. This was completely her, I confirmed. He looked at the desk. At the surface of it, where the half-dried coffee cup had been. I had finally removed it, gently, the week before, when I had begun to understand that preserving the room was not the same as refusing to move forward. He looked at the space where the box had been found, the baseboard now replaced, the walls smooth and unmarked. She sat here, he said. Every morning, I said. For 30 years. This was where she thought. He turned back to the window. I watched his shoulders and the way he held himself and thought about what it meant to stand in the room where your mother had lived her private life, the life underneath the life, the one you had been sealed out of and were only now, at 35, being admitted to. I'm angry at her, he said quietly. Not an accusation. A fact, stated with the honesty of a man who did not hide from his own interior weather. That's fair, I said. And I miss her, he said. which makes no sense, because I never knew her. But I miss what could have been. The version of this where she wasn't afraid. I miss that version too, I said. He turned around and looked at me. I keep thinking about what it would have been like, he said. If she'd told you. If you'd known from the beginning. If there had been, he stopped. If you'd had a father, I said. The words sat between us in the morning water blue room like something solid. Yes, he said. I looked at my son. I thought about everything it had taken to arrive at this room on this morning. The split pipe, the sealed box, the 4 days of sitting with the truth before I could carry it 40 miles, the 3 hours in a kitchen in Crestview Falls, the DNA results on a Thursday morning, the breakfast with the good dishes. I thought about Wendy, who had been afraid and had paid for it, and had left behind the evidence of her love along with the evidence of her failure, as if she had understood that the two could not be separated, that you could not honestly claim the love without also owning the cost of it. I thought about what she had asked me in her letter. Please don't let my cowardice be the thing that defines what we were. I understood now that she had meant something larger than I had initially read. She had not only been asking me not to define our marriage by its hidden wound. She had been asking me, in the only way available to her, to do for Thomas what she had not been able to do herself. To show up. To be present. To let him know, in the most concrete and undeniable way, that he was worth the showing up for. Thomas, I said. He looked at me. I am 68 years old, I said. I am aware that 68 is a late start for this kind of thing. I am aware that you have lived 35 years without me and built a full and good life, and that you do not need a father in the way a child needs a father. That season has passed, and neither of us can recover it. I paused. But I am also aware that a man does not stop needing connection because he is past childhood, that there is no age at which knowing where you come from stops mattering. And I would like, if you are willing, to spend whatever years I have left being someone you can call. Someone who knows your work and respects it. Someone who comes to Crestview Falls and sees what you are building. I stopped, steadied myself. Someone who is proud of you. Because I am already proud of you, Thomas, and I have known you for less than 2 weeks, and I think that is the most windy thing about this whole situation. She gave me a son I didn't know I had, and he turned out to be exactly the kind of man worth knowing. Thomas stood by the window of his mother's office. He looked at me for a long moment with those wide-set eyes that were Wendy's and that had, I now understood, been looking for exactly this. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic reunion, but the simple, stated, unambiguous thing. The declaration. The showing up. Okay, he said. His voice was steady, but something in it had shifted, opened, the way Thomas Harwell opened. Quietly, completely, without performance. Okay, I said. Rebecca flew in from Atlanta 2 weeks before Christmas. She had been patient. More patient than her nature strictly preferred. She told me on the phone the night before her flight, in the dry, self-aware way she had that reminded me so powerfully of Wendy that it sometimes stopped my breath. She had been patient and she had read Wendy's letter when I had offered it, and she had cried in the way she cried, which was briefly and completely, and then with the practicality of someone moving forward. And she had said, when she finished crying, well, Mom was always full of surprises, which was the most Rebecca thing she could possibly have said about it. She met Thomas on a Saturday afternoon at the house on Sycamore Lane. I had made pot roast. Wendy's recipe, the full one, with the carrots and the pearl onions and the low, slow heat that meant the house smelled like something good for 4 hours before anyone arrived. I had set the dining room table with the good dishes, the ones we brought out for actual occasions, and I had put a fire in the fireplace because December in Tennessee required a fire in the fireplace if you had one, and we had one, and I intended to use it. Rebecca arrived first. She hugged me in the doorway with the full force of her relief. She had been worried about me since the phone call, the way children worry about parents who are navigating things alone, and holding her on the front porch of the house where she had grown up, I felt the specific gratitude of a man who understood he was not, in fact, navigating things alone. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway with a bottle of wine he had clearly given some thought to. Not expensive, not cheap, just considered. And he looked at Rebecca, and Rebecca looked at him, and I watched the moment of recognition cross her face the way it had crossed mine when I had first seen him clearly. She said, almost to herself, "Oh, you look like Dad." Thomas glanced at me. I nodded. Rebecca crossed the room and hugged him. Not the careful hug of strangers being polite. The real kind. The kind that said, I have been expecting you. I didn't know I was expecting you. But now that you're here, I can feel the space you were supposed to fill. She is her mother's daughter in many ways. But in that moment, she was something all her own. A 30-year-old woman recognizing her brother for the first time and not requiring any further information to know that it was right. Thomas stood in my living room with his arms around a sister he had not known existed until 2 weeks ago, and I stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room and watched my family locate itself in the space of the house on Sycamore Lane, and I thought about Wendy. I thought about her with the full complexity she deserved, not the sanitized version, not the villain version, but the actual woman. The woman who had been brave enough to love me and not brave enough to tell me the truth, who had kept photographs behind a baseboard because she could not bring herself to keep nothing, who had written letters to a man in Crestview Falls for 27 years because the alternative was total silence, and total silence was not something she could sustain, who had loved her son from 40 miles away and her husband from the same bed, and had spent her life trying to be worthy of both loves, without knowing how to reconcile them. She had not been able to reconcile them. She had left that work to me, and I had done it. Imperfectly, at a cost, not without anger and grief and 4 days of sitting with a truth that reordered everything. But I had done it. I had driven 40 miles and knocked on a door and sat in a kitchen in Crestview Falls and told a stranger who was my son the truth he had been owed since before he could walk, and I had brought him here, to this table, to this fire, to this family that was now 3 when it had been 1, and the pot roast was ready and the good dishes were set, and the fire was going, and the house on Sycamore Lane smelled like a home. I did it, Wendy, I said silently, to the space where she lived in me now, not the space of grief, which was still there and would always be there, but a different space, larger and less painful, the space where you keep the full version of a person you loved. I finished what you couldn't. We're all right. The December wind moved through the oak trees on Sycamore Lane, and the fire crackled in the fireplace. And from the living room came the sound of Rebecca's laughter at something Thomas had said, and the sound of Thomas laughing back, low and even and unhurried. The laugh of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down somewhere safe. We ate dinner at the dining room table, the 3 of us, with the good dishes and the fire and the pot roast and a bottle of wine that Thomas had brought, and that turned out to be exactly right. We talked for 4 hours. We talked about Wendy. Really talked about her, not carefully or guardedly but fully, with all the complexity she deserved. Rebecca told Thomas stories about their mother that made him laugh and occasionally go quiet with the expression of a man receiving something he had waited a long time for. Thomas told us about Daniel, about growing up in Crestview Falls, about the man Daniel had been and the way he had raised a son alone with such steady competence that Thomas had not understood until he was an adult how hard that must have actually been. I told them both things I had not told anyone. Things from the early years of the marriage. Things from the letters in the shoebox that I had read with Thomas in his kitchen. Things from Wendy's private life that she had left for me to understand and share when the time was right. The time was right. At some point, Rebecca reached across the table and covered Thomas's hand with hers, the unconscious gesture of a sibling, the casual claim of family. And Thomas looked at her hand on his, and then looked at her with an expression that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, as one of the most purely human things I have ever seen on a person's face. Relief. The deep, structural, long-deferred relief of someone who has spent their whole life knowing something was missing and has finally found out what it was. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Rebecca had settled on the couch with her wine and Thomas was standing at the living room window looking out at the December street, I went upstairs. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. I wake up every morning at 5:47. I make my coffee in the kitchen on Sycamore Lane and I stand at the window and watch the morning come up over the ridge, and the cardinals come to the feeder that Wendy put up the year before she died, and the rooster clock ticks on the wall, with its cracked face that she never replaced, because she said a clock with a cracked face had more character than a perfect one. Everything is the same. Everything is different. Thomas calls on Sunday evenings. He is building a house, an actual house, on a lot in Crestview Falls that he has been sitting on for 3 years waiting for the right project, and the right project turned out to be his own. He tells me about the framing, the foundation work, the decisions he is making about materials and structure, and I listen with the attention of a man who spent 41 years in lumber and hardware and knows the difference between wood that will last and wood that is merely holding its shape for now. Last Sunday, he asked me what I thought about old growth versus engineered flooring for the main rooms. I told him. He argued with me. We talked for 45 minutes about flooring. It was one of the best conversations I've had in years. Rebecca comes home for the holidays now and brings Thomas with her, or meets him here, and the house on Sycamore Lane is full in December in a way it has not been since Wendy was alive. Full of the particular noise and warmth of people who belong to each other claiming their belonging, which is the best possible use of a house that was built for exactly that purpose. I am still angry at Wendy. I want to be honest about that. I think I will be angry at her in specific moments for the rest of my life, and I think that is appropriate and fair and does not contradict the love. Anger and love are not opposites. I have learned that in the hardest possible way, and I have made my peace with it. I forgave her. Not the easy forgiveness that costs nothing, but the real kind. The kind that requires you to hold the full weight of what was done and choose, with that weight fully in your hands, to set it down. I forgave her for Thomas, for the 41 years, for the fear that had been more powerful than her honesty. I forgave her because she had loved me genuinely and completely within the limits of what her courage had allowed, and because the letter she left behind was the bravest thing she had ever written, and because the box behind the baseboard was, in its strange and painful way, a gift. She gave me a son, imperfectly, posthumously, with all the complications of a truth delivered too late and at too high a cost. But she gave him to me, and he is here. On the first Saturday of the new year, Thomas came to Sycamore Lane with a truck. He had offered, weeks ago, to fix a section of the back porch railing that had been rotting quietly for 2 years. I had been meaning to address it and not addressing it, the way you don't address things that remind you of the person who used to notice such things before you had to. He came with the right materials and the right tools, and he worked on the porch railing for 3 hours while I sat in the wooden chair that had been on this porch since Wendy and I moved in and drank coffee and watched. I watched my son work. He worked the way I had worked for 40 years, with focus and competence and the quiet satisfaction of a person who understood that building something well was its own reward. He worked with his broad, square-fingered hands, those hands I had recognized in a photograph before I knew whose they were, and the winter morning was cold and clear around us, and the cardinals were at the feeder, and the old oak at the corner of the yard stood in its bare winter patience, and Sycamore Lane was quiet. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the railing with the critical eye of a craftsman assessing his own work. "That'll hold," he said. "I can see that," I said. He turned and looked at me. I looked back at him. There are moments that don't need decoration. Moments that are complete in themselves, that require nothing added. No music, no movement, no words that try to name what is already fully present. This was one of those moments, and we both understood it as such, and we let it be what it was. My son, standing on my porch, in the winter light. Wendy's eyes looking back at me from a face I recognized as my own. The railing, repaired. The house, still standing. The family, still here. She looks like trouble, Dorothy had said about Julianne, in a hospital room a long time ago, and she had been right in a way that had eventually proven survivable. "Wendy, I thought, you were full of trouble too." But standing on that porch on a January morning with my son and my coffee and the cold clear air and the cardinals at the feeder, I looked at what the trouble had finally, imperfectly, belatedly, at considerable cost, and with considerable grace, produced. And I found that I was grateful. Not for the secret. Not for the years of not knowing. Not for the grief that had been layered on top of grief, the loss on top of loss. The discovery that the person you were already mourning had been larger and more complicated than the mourning you were already doing. Grateful for what had survived it. For what was standing on the other side of the hardest thing. Repaired, rebuilt, held together by the slow and patient work of people who had decided that love was worth the trouble of its most difficult demands. That was what Wendy had left behind. Not the secret, the opportunity, the chance to do what she couldn't. To be, in the end, less afraid. The cardinal landed on the feeder in the January light, the bright red male, the one that had been coming since the year Wendy died, and for a moment it looked directly at the porch with that imperious, alert expression that had always reminded me of her. Then it went back to eating. Some things, I have learned, stay exactly as they are. And some things, the things that matter most, turn out to have been growing all along, in the dark, behind the walls, waiting for someone to be brave enough to let them into the light. Mr. ZAHA didn't just find a secret. He found a son. He found the rest of his family. He found the full version of the woman he had loved for 41 years, imperfect and real and worth knowing completely. Comment below right now, what moment in this entire story hit you the deepest? Was it the letter Wendy left behind? Was it the moment Rebecca hugged Thomas for the first time? Was it Thomas fixing that porch railing in the January light? Or was it something quieter, something that reminded you of your own life, your own family, your own hidden rooms? Drop everything in the comments. Every single one of you who made it to the end of this story, I see you. Tell me what you felt. I read every words. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell.